Greetings, Daily Dose viewers. I'm Scott Callahan. I'm the host of Daily Dose of Aramaic. And I just want to tell you it was so great to see many of you at the Greek and Hebrew for Life Conference 2023 that we just concluded. It was great to see you there and to be able to share with you firsthand about the textbook Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters by Glossa House, as well as to share in the ministry with Daily Dose of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin as well. Well, let me tell you why we have a special episode now, and that is we have hit 500 Daily Dose of Aramaic videos. This includes the ones you access via the Learn tab on dailydoseofaramaic.com, which are the videos that teach through Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters. So if you haven't had a chance to study Aramaic before, now's your chance. Begin with the textbook, and I'll teach through it with you. And then let's start reading the biblical text with the assistance of the textbook. So I'm thrilled now at the milestone of having 500 videos in our archive to introduce to you a special episode in which I get to interview Miles Van Pelt, who himself is the author of a grammar of biblical Aramaic. Well, welcome everyone to this special bonus episode of Daily Dose of Aramaic. It's a joy today to welcome Miles Van Pelt to talk about his life, his ministry, his work in Aramaic, and other kind of topics that may come up during our conversation. Dr. Miles Van Pelt, he earned his Doctor of Philosophy from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and is the Allen Hayes Belcher Jr. Professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages and director of the Summer Institute for Biblical Languages at Reformed Theological Seminary, Jackson. Dr. Van Pelt has a strong commitment to and passion for teaching students the Bible in its original languages and has published extensively in the area of Hebrew and Aramaic language instruction as well as biblical theology. As for Hebrew, many Daily Dose of Aramaic viewers may have begun their Hebrew studies with basics of biblical Hebrew. And a fun fact is, I think, could be wrong, but I think Dr. Van Pelt put this book in my hands 20 years ago at an Evangelical Theological Society meeting. So there's that.
Wow.
And then here, as far as I know, is the most recent edition of that book, the third edition. So it's nice and big. So lots of, it's not small font, plus there's room to take notes in here if you want to do that kind of thing. As for Aramaic, we celebrate the second edition of Basics of Biblical Aramaic, which I'm excited. It's going to be in the mail to me very soon, which as of the date of this interview will be published tomorrow, at least according to the online bookstores, July 4th, 2023. And as for biblical theology, a notable recent work is his edited volume, A Biblical Theological Introduction to the Old Testament, The Gospel Promised. At RTS, Dr. Van Pelt teaches Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew exegesis, Joshua to Esther, and courses on the books of Judges and the Song of Songs. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Van Pelt to Daily Dose of Aramaic. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that great introduction. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And it is really exciting to be able to have this time. And I know you're incredibly busy. Can you tell our Daily Dose of Aramaic viewers what you're doing right now?
Sure. This is week 3 of intensive summer Hebrew. We have something called the Summer Institute for Biblical Languages out here. And rather than take your course over the academic year in the midst of all your other classes, we teach Greek 1 and 2 and Hebrew 1 and 2 each summer. In an intensive, it's 8 weeks, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. And we go through the whole grammar. And it's kind of immersive and intensive, horrifying to some students, but very, very fun. And we've done that for many, many years here at Jackson. I've had a great success with teaching and encouraging students with the biblical languages.
So you said it's 3 hours per day, right?
Right.
And so is there a possibility of a student taking more than one language at a time, or it's just, that's it, one language?
No, we teach, like I'm teaching Hebrew this summer, Dr. Glad's teaching Greek, we teach 9 to 12, that kind of thing. When Glad's on sabbatical, they'll teach Hebrew in the morning, then Greek in the afternoon. And then one summer, I don't ever recommend this. I taught Hebrew in the morning, Greek in the afternoon, and Aramaic twice a week after that for students who
Oh,
wanted to be here. And I was tired after that. So yeah, I was tired of it. But no, I don't think you can learn Hebrew and Greek together over one summer because they're both so demanding at that
and
time.
different.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Different. So
Right.
yeah, I've only had, to be honest, I had someone audit the class who did that one year when I taught it like that. He took both Hebrew and Greek. He was 10 years old and he was one of my best students. So
Was it someone in your family?
no, someone,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it would sound like it. Some of my kids have had Greek and Hebrew with me, but not that.
Okay. Well, it is all the more an honor to have you with us, given that you have
Well,
that Summer Language Institute going on right now.
always happy to talk about biblical languages with people.
Well, good, good. Well, can you share with us a more general question? We'll get more specific as we go along. What led you to become an academic in the field of biblical studies?
Yeah. Um, in 1989, I went to Azusa Pacific University to finish my degree. I had done the first 2 years at junior college, was going to finish my degree there in Bible. And I actually started as a Christian education major. And so you had to take Bible classes. And my first class there was Hebrew prophets with a guy named John Hartley.
Hmm.
And I was immediately transfixed, mesmerized by the academic study of the Bible. I had never, ever, ever encountered it until that day, fall of '89. And I just knew at some level, this is what I want to do. I'd known I'd want to go into ministry. I'd not known exactly what that was. But the academic study of the Bible. And in that very class, a graduate student brought in her Hebrew Bible one day. And she showed it to me. I'd never seen one. And I was like, whoa, this is an amazing thing. There's no way you can really read this, right? It's crazy. Look at all those dots and dashes. I said, this was not meant for mortal eyes. And she said, no, she can. And it's a wonderful thing. And I thought, like, we've got to learn this. And so a couple of us asked Dr. Hartley to teach us Hebrew because it wasn't offered in the curriculum. He said, well, if you can get it, 5 students, I'll teach it to you. And we got six crazy people. And we studied for the next 2 years with him, Hebrew. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And so that's kind of how I got introduced to it. Then the next year, so I had Hebrew with Dr. Hartley in 90. In 91, I had Greek with Bill Mounts from Basics of Biblical Greek.
Oh, okay.
And it was his last year there and the year before his BBG came out, the Greek grammar. So we were the last test case. And so he not only taught me Greek, but he taught me how to teach a language. And so both the content and the pedagogy. And I thought, oh, someone needs to do that for Hebrew. It would just transform the way it was studied. And 10 years later, BBH came out, and I was so, in God's providence, my connection with Bill Mounts and Zondervan for some other things, that's what happened. And so, in fact, BBH, I was working on BBH after I had started a PhD program that had to pull out of because of family health issues. And I thought, man, if I'm ever going to actually be able to teach this, I better go get my PhD. And so I went and studied with Peter Gentry at Southern Seminary at that point, and it was a life-changing experience to study with him. And the grammar came out my first year of doctoral studies, and so it's been crazy ever since. I've loved it.
Well, that's great. Well, we got a beginning of the answer to this question. Please share a sketch of your academic career, especially highlighting the parts that involve the teaching and the writing about the biblical languages.
Okay. Well, when I went to seminary specifically to study the Old Testament because I wanted to do Old Testament studies. And so I did that. And I taught at Gordon College for a little bit. They hired me to teach Greek. And then I taught Introduction to Old Testament and a little bit of Hebrew for students on the side who would do it by directed study. After doing that for a few years, we moved overseas to do PhD work with Gordon Wenham. And we were in England for 6 months, and we had some family health issues. We had to come back and pull out of that program. We couldn't go back to it. But that's actually, when I came back and we moved back to New England, my wife worked at Gordon Conwell and I worked at Gordon College. And that's when I met Gary Pratico. And Bill Mounts had come from Azusa Pacific University now to Gordon Conwell in God's Providence. And Bill introduced me to Gary Pratico. And so it was this kind of, the catastrophe became a eucatastrophe. And so, all things are meant for good at that point. And so I kind of found that I loved the Old Testament biblical theology, but I really loved teaching the students the languages because it was so exciting for them to kind of be able to read the Word of God in the original language. They felt it to be an intimate thing, a transforming thing. And I just felt like, man, if I could just create tools that would help students learn the language without as much fear and without just as much crazy rote paradigm memorization, so just drudgery, then we could build a better system. And so, I basically used Bill Mounts' pedagogy to teach Hebrew, and Pratico had already been himself bent that way anyway. So we were a good team together, and we just worked together. And initially, Zondervan wasn't, Zondervan, this is not going to fly. Like Greek, everyone studies. Hebrew, no one studies. And so they said, well, we'll take a chance. And they did, and it's done fairly well. It's still, after 22 years, it's still in print, and people have benefited from it. Years later, I wanted to write the Aramaic grammar as well, so we had one for all the biblical languages. And they said, "No way! Are we going to do that?" Like Verlin was the editor there. He goes, we had to do a stretch for Aramaic. I mean, for Hebrew, and I still put a proposal in, and at first it was no. And Verlin wanted me to write English grammar to ace biblical Hebrew. And I said, man, that does not sound like me. I did not grow up in a very good English educational environment. So I know how to speak it, but I don't know all the grammatical contours all the time. Probably someone more sophisticated in English should do it. And he said, no, you're the guy for it. You're the guy for it. You're the guy for it. I refused like 3 times. And so I finally said, Verlin, if you let me go ahead and publish the Aramaic grammar, I'll do this for you. And he said, okay. And that's how it started. And
that's fantastic.
And there's basics of biblical, we have Syriac, Akkadian, Ugaritic, Arabic, Latin. I mean, there's really this wonderful renaissance in language learning for biblical studies. And it's great because, at the end of the 20th century, it seemed to be dying out among evangelicals.
Yes, so, it sounds like your basics of biblical Hebrew and then basics of biblical Aramaic kind of kicked open the door a little bit.
Yeah, I think it opened them to possibilities because the Greek grammar was killing it on the market. Mounts' grammar was kind of just sweeping across the nation. And so I think, sure, I wrote on some of the coattails of that, like, oh, it's basics of biblical, so let's do it, kind of that. So I didn't know what I call like purpose-driven Hebrew or Christ-centered Hebrew, like to build up some of those other popular titles. But it was really, it's been a wonderful, joyful experience. It's the Hebrew grammar has been translated now into Korean and Chinese, French, and Russian is almost done, and Spanish is almost done. And so, there are people across the world that are learning more about the Bible from work that I've done. It's so rewarding to know that brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world that I'll never know are getting tools and resources that have come out of this office. And so I'm thankful for God's providence and kindness and all the good favor that we've had for this. And it's a wonderful thing. I keep on going. So as long as they'll keep doing new editions and other resources, let's do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things 20 something years ago when the first edition came out that was relatively new was the diagnostic reading approach versus you mentioned that the norm was memorize everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a lot. I mean, I studied with Weingren. That was my grammar. And we just memorized paradigm after paradigm after paradigm. I called it the solo bootstrappa approach to learning the language. So, and I always wanted to learn, like, why did the vowels change? And why did that assimilate? And why did that drop off? And then I realized, like, oh, there are rules for this and we can simplify it. And that's really what Mounts did as well. He took all of, like, you had to memorize some paradigms, but it's minimalistic. And then you learn something like, oh, theta, eta, sigma is future passive, or sigma alpha is first aorist. And you learn to build words rather than all the thousands of possibilities that were out there, because you couldn't ever memorize enough paradigms to account for all the forms. And
Would you
so,
say it's kind of like learning a language as a human instead of a computer?
yes, exactly right. Yeah. I like knowing how the verbs work and why things change and drop off and the history behind them and why segolate nouns are weird and stuff like that. It makes there's not exceptions. There are just lots of rules that are applied over and over again in different contexts. And if you know that those rules that govern those things, it can make you more like a Masoret. You know what I mean? You kind of know what's going on and it's less intimidating. Yeah.
Mm,
If I can get my students to like reading Hebrew, I know they'll do it longer and and throughout their careers. So that's my goal, is to get them to like it or to love it, actually.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. And maybe that plays into this question. Since your work on third hay verbs for your dissertation, some
So
of our
exciting.
dissertations have exciting, titles like yours did. Your work has rightly been strongly connected with biblical languages. Could you comment on how your work in biblical languages has influenced your biblical theology?
Right. In this way, all my biblical theology is textually driven. And if all my biblical theology is textually driven, I need the text. Right. One of Peter Gentry, one of my mentors at Southern Seminary and my PhD advisor, said, without morphology, you can have no theology. Right. And so I really feel like without grammar and syntax and the words, right, it's so hard to see the connections that are in the text because of how translations have to translate things in ways to make sense to English speaking ears, but we kind of lose some of the good stuff in the back. In Ruth chapter 3, when the leaders of the town praise her as the woman of virtue. All right. Well, it's not the leaders of the town, it's the people of the gate know that you are a worthy woman. And that word for gate is the last line of Proverbs 31. And the word for
Yes.
worthy woman is in the first line. And so it's intentionally hyperlinking the book of Ruth as the illustration of the Proverbs 31 woman. And so you can do that if you know the languages, but it's very difficult without the languages. So it can make your
Yes.
biblical theology richer, more precise, and more robust.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. You're a busy guy.
Yeah.
As we close,
Sure.
what would you like to say to our viewers about the value of learning Aramaic?
There are 269 verses that appear in our Old Testament that are Aramaic. And I want to know how to read every verse in that Bible. It's like I want to know everything about my wife. There's nothing I want to leave out or not know about her. Right. So I'm going to train myself not just to read it, but to love to read it and to build my theological systems from that. And so, it's two words in Genesis, a verse in Jeremiah, the middle of Daniel, and then two chunks in Ezra. And that's like taking out 1st, 2nd Timothy, Jude, and maybe James or something like that of the New Testament. And it's no small thing to learn Aramaic in order to read that material faithfully. Plus, here's the other benefit. Learning Aramaic makes your Hebrew so much better because you're learning a sister language that's really a lot more difficult because it's an international language at the time. And so when you get back to Hebrew, you feel like, oh, a breath of fresh air. This is so easy. And so and you get to see the connections between the two and how the dialects work and stuff like that. So I would just say it's worth it. And if you give yourself to it and allow yourself to love it, I think you'll be transformed by it.
Well, I agree completely. It's just great to hear that from others
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. And
And
also thank you for your work with your grammar and Daily Dose of Aramaic. It's wonderful stuff. I feel like the more resources we can get out there, the more students will have access to various approaches, and there's no one size fits all. And so we need more Aramaic grammar still and more Hebrew grammar still that will help in kind of this Renaissance and Reformation in a love and study of the biblical languages.
yes, well, let's do everything we can to contribute to
Yeah.
this Reformation, this
Yeah.
Renaissance,
Amen.
this blossoming of knowledge and excitement about language,
Yeah.
especially as it relates to the Bible.
Yeah. Especially because it relates to the Bible. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Dr. Van Pelt, what an awesome privilege to be able to have this time, to be able to share about, common loves
Yes,
That's what this
that's
interview
exactly right.
has been a lot like. And as we do this for our viewers of Daily Dose of Aramaic, we recognize it's not just us. We recognize we have this love that's shared by so many people all over the world. So we thank you, the viewer, as well for your time today and having a moment to sit down with us, both Dr. Van Pelt and me, on this special episode of Daily Dose of Aramaic.